A light in the fog, the isolated life at Eddystone Lighthouse granite, salt and silence, long before the age of automated navigation, satellites, and GPS. The sea was a place where silence held danger. For ships traveling the English Channel in the 18th century, the waters surrounding the Eddystone rocks off the coast of Devon were among the most treacherous. These jagged outcrops lurked just below the surface of the waves, invisible during storms or heavy fog, waiting to tear through the wooden hulls of passing merchant vessels. For centuries, these rocks claimed hundreds of lives, each death a quiet tragedy forgotten by all but the families left behind. It was here, at this perilous site, that one of the earliest and most stubbornly enduring symbols of maritime safety rose. The Eddystone Lighthouse. You may picture the life of a lighthouse keeper as romantic, or perhaps a bit heroic. But in the 1700s, it was a slow erosion of body and mind, a quiet endurance test measured not in days, but in storms survived and the weight of routine. The first few attempts to build a lighthouse here ended in failure disaster, really. But our story begins in 1759, when a Scottish civil engineer named John Smeaton completed what would become the third incarnation of the Eddystone Lighthouse. His design was based on the curve of an oak tree's trunk, a choice that would revolutionize maritime architecture. And within this tower of stone, exposed to gales and waves in profound isolation, lived the keepers. There were usually 2 to 3 men stationed at the lighthouse at any given time. They worked in shifts that lasted weeks, sometimes months. The structure itself was only 72 feet tall, but inside it felt even smaller. The base was for supplies barrels of salt pork, sacks of hardtack, spare lamp oil, thick rope, and tools. Above that was the living quarters, bunks no wider than a coffin, a tiny table, a chamber pot, and a single porthole. At the top sat the lantern room, housing the light a whale oil lamp burning behind polished parabolic reflectors. Each night, the keepers trimmed the wick, polished the lenses, and kept the light going without fail. If the light went out, ships could die. For these men, boredom was not just a nuisance, it was a creeping threat. The days passed slowly, marked by meals and chores. They wound the mechanism that rotated the lens, scraped salt off the walls, took readings of wind speed, checked for cracks in the masonry. The sea was their only companion, and it gave little comfort. In winter, gales would hurl waves high enough to crash over the top of the tower. The entire structure would tremble. Sometimes water leaked into the sleeping bunks, soaking there. Blankets and supplies. There were no radios, no contact with the mainland, except through passing supply boats, weather permitting. One keeper, Thomas Chittens, kept a journal for a few months in 1774 before abandoning the effort. In one entry, he described waking up to ice forming on the inside of the walls. Another noted his frustration with a fellow keeper who sang the same sea shanty every evening for 12 days. The mental pressure of sharing such a confined space could lead to strange behaviors. Arguments over card games, over how the porridge was stirred, or even over who was assigned to polish the brass, became thunderous matters in the echoing stone tower. On at least one occasion, a keeper had to be forcibly removed from the lighthouse after weeks of erratic behavior and attempted sabotage of the lantern. What is often forgotten is how precise and mundane the duties of a lighthouse keeper truly were. They recorded the burn rate of the lamp oil, sometimes to the ounce. They measured temperature, humidity, and wind speed at regular intervals. They charted passing ships when visible. Everything had to be documented. And then there was cleaning. Soot built up on the lamp glass, and every smudge meant a slight dimming of the light. They cleaned the glass twice a day, using vinegar and cloth. Even during storms, meals were usually taken in silence, interrupted only by the wind moaning through the cracks in the shutters. Breakfast might be oat porridge. Lunch, pickled herring. Or salt beef. For dinner, if they had caught nothing in the trap baskets, more beef. The food was salted, hard, or preserved with vinegar. Fresh water was strictly rationed, collected in barrels when the rain allowed. A poor rationing strategy meant brackish water, or worse, complete dryness until the next resupply. One keeper wrote that the worst part was not the storms or the food, but the silence that fell between waves. It is not the sea that makes a man mad, he wrote, but the moment when the sea forgets to speak. At such moments, a keeper might find himself staring at the walls, trying to count how many grains of sand were embedded in the mortar between the stones. Or he might listen for the next creak in the wood above, convincing himself that the tower had shifted slightly since the day before. During their off-shift hours, they might mend nets, whittle, or write letters, though there was little hope of those letters reaching the mainland unless the supply boat arrived soon. Many keepers took up knitting to pass the time. Some wrote poetry. A few etched drawings into the wooden floor, small scenes of coastal towns or imagined ships. These small acts were a defense against invisibility, the creeping fear that if they disappeared, no one would know or remember Dot, and indeed, many were forgotten. The death records for lighthouse keepers during this period are vague at best. Some died of illness, others of accidents while trying to descend into boats during storms. One tale, possibly exaggerated over time, tells of a keeper whose partner died early in their shift. Fearing that he would be accused of foul play, the surviving keeper reportedly tied the corpse to the bunk and continued his duties for weeks, living in the same room as the decaying body until the next supply boat arrived. Despite these hardships, the light never went out. It was their one sacred charge. Storm or fog, sickness or madness, the flame had to burn. It was not for glory or recognition. No one ever came to thank them, but because that beam of light might save a ship of strangers. That was enough. Eddystone Lighthouse stood strong during the late 18th century, weathering storms and testing its keepers. But what happened when things went wrong, not just with the weather, but with the men themselves? When the delicate balance of sanity, duty, and companionship broke down in the face of endless monotony and wind? Section 2. Madness at sea level by the late 1700s. The Eddystone Lighthouse had become an enduring fixture of maritime safety. Its flickering oil lamp, a beacon for ships threading the fog-bound English Channel. But while the stone tower stood, resolute against wind and wave, the same could not always be said for the men inside. In Section 1, we explored the relentless routine of lighthouse life, its creaking silences, salted rations, and scratchy blankets. But what happened when that monotony slipped into something more fragile? The answer lay not in one dramatic incident, but in a pattern scattered across logs, journals, and the fading edges of maritime folklore. Men who took up duty at Eddystone or other lighthouses of the era were not soldiers, not monks, and not explorers. They were often former fishermen or seamen, used to hardship but not isolation. They were chosen not for psychological resilience, but for availability and a willingness to accept low pay for long stretches away from civilization. Most assumed they would cope. Some did, others did not. The psychological toll of lighthouse keeping had no formal name in the 18th century. But today, we might recognize it as a form of cabin fever compounded by claustrophobia, sensory deprivation, and an inescapable sense of entrapment. Keepers lived in rotating pairs or trios, which meant that the failure of social cohesion could become an existential problem. One well-documented case from a nearby Cornish lighthouse, longships, helps us understand the risks. Though not Eddystone specifically, the pattern was much the same. Two men, Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith, were stationed together for a particularly long rotation. Howell, described as quiet and reserved, began complaining in the logbook. Of improper conduct by Griffith details unclear, though possibly a breach in routine or personal hygiene. In turn, Griffith retaliated with silence, then erratic bursts of laughter and singing during the night. The logbook entries became shorter, more hurried. Then they stopped. When the relief crew finally arrived, after delays due to storms, they found Howell alone, hollow-eyed and near mute. Griffith's body was propped up in a makeshift coffin of spare boards, tied with rope to prevent movement. During storms, the records suggest Griffith had died in an accident, possibly a fall, but Howell had refused to throw the body into the sea, fearing he would be accused of murder. With no other option, he had eaten, slept, and worked beside the decomposing corpse for nearly 2 weeks. While Eddystone had more rigorous rotation protocols than smaller lighthouses, the fundamental fragility of such arrangements persisted. Keepers were human, and their humanity became distorted in the unnatural stillness of tower life. Some reported hallucinations, voices in the fog, music from the rocks, faces in the soot of the lantern glass. Others developed obsessive routines, rearranging supplies by weight, recoiling ropes to precise lengths, or writing the same sentence over and over in the logbook. Light trimmed, light trimmed, light trimmed. To cope, many turned inward. Letters sent ashore were often more formal than personal, as if dictated through layers of constraint. A letter from a keeper named Elias Fenworth, dated 1779, read in part, "All is well here. The sea is with us as always. The lamp burns clear. We remain at our duties." The same phrasing appears in multiple letters, suggesting either a required template or a self-imposed uniformity meant to fend off doubt. The keepers were not completely forgotten by the world. The Trinity House, the organization responsible for lighthouse maintenance, kept strict schedules for supply and relief, weather permitting. Supply boats, typically manned by local sailors, brought fresh oil, water, preserved food, replacement clothing, and newspapers. But landfall was dangerous. In high seas, the keepers had to lower ropes to haul up crates, with the boatmen below, bracing against the surge. A single mistake could result in loss of cargo or a man. Keepers rotated in and out of duty in stretches of 4 to 6 weeks, though bad weather could extend this to double or triple the planned term. Relief crews sometimes arrived to find a tower running low on water, keepers emaciated and delirious, or in some cases refusing to leave. One account from 1787 describes a keeper who had become so attached to the routine that he begged to remain behind, sobbing when told he was being replaced. What drove some men to madness while others endured? There was no formal study, of course, but there are clues. Those who brought quiet hobbies, whittling, sewing, letter writing, even memorization of scripture, seemed to fare better. Alcohol was discouraged, though some smuggled small flasks, using them sparingly to blunt fear during storms. Others recited poetry aloud. One journal entry describes a keeper memorizing entire passages from Milton's Paradise Lost, repeating them into the wind until his voice grew hoarse. Companionship was critical, but unpredictable. There was little room for privacy, none, in fact, when the seas were rough. You slept in shifts, but within 6 feet of your companion. Foul moods, smells, and disagreements about chores could escalate quickly. And yet, there are also records of quiet friendships formed, 2 men playing chess carved into the tabletop, or taking turns reading aloud by lantern light. In such circumstances, a shared silence could be a sign not of awkwardness but comfort. One figure who stood out in these years was Josiah Bray, a seasoned keeper who served multiple rotations at Eddystone between 1762 and 1778. Known for his discipline and consistency, Bray kept meticulous records, not just of oil use and weather, but also of emotional states. He wrote, "My companion shows signs of the gloom again today. I have assigned him extra work polishing the rail. This seems to help." His methods were adopted informally by others. Structure as therapy, duty as a shield against despair. Ed. Weisstone itself faced few mechanical failures during this time, thanks to Smeaton's revolutionary dovetail stonework and hydraulic mortar. But the human element remained vulnerable. One fire broke out in the oil storage room in 1773, reportedly caused by a carelessly dropped lantern. The keepers managed to extinguish it using seawater hauled up in buckets, but only barely. The report submitted to Trinity House was sparse, possibly to avoid blame, but privately. The men involved later admitted they considered jumping into the sea when the flames grew too high. That they didn't speaks more to the impossible risk of escape than to any heroism. Despite these hardships, recruitment was rarely difficult. Wages were modest but steady, and in periods of economic downturn, the lighthouse offered stability. Young men from Devon, Cornwall, and even further afield applied to serve, many unaware of the psychological demands. It was not uncommon for first-time keepers to leave after one rotation, declining further duty without explanation. And yet, the light stayed on. Through all of this, the tempers, the silences, the makeshift coffins and frozen bunk blankets, Eddystone fulfilled its purpose. Hundreds of ships passed safely. The beam of light, refracted through curved glass and polished copper, cut through fog and darkness to guide sailors home. No one applauded. No medals were given. But the logbooks, those thin traces of lived experience, remain. There, the details. Our mundane, wind, westerly, lamp lit at 7:13, glass cleaned, supply boat overdue. And beneath those lines, the weight of isolation persists. But what happened to the men who left? Those who served their time, descended the tower for the last time, and returned to the world? Were they changed by the silence and storms? What the sea left behind when a lighthouse keeper descended the spiral stair for the last time, stepping off the supply boat and returning to the mainland, the world he re-entered was rarely the same, 'cause the one he had left. Time moved differently in the tower days folded into one another, and the rhythms of land-based life could feel jarring, even alien. What became of the men who kept the light at Eddystone? What did the sea leave behind? In them, very few keepers returned to their old professions. The transition back to ordinary life was not always smooth. In the parish records of Devon and Cornwall, several former lighthouse keepers are noted with marginalia, such as solitary or odd habits. The local perception was that these men had gone soft in the head or come back wrong. They often spoke little, and when they did, their topics were sometimes abstract or irrelevant to town life-wide directions. Tides, the exact minute the sun disappeared over the water. A former keeper named Abel Rawlins returned to Plymouth in 1784 and attempted to work as a dockhand. He was dismissed after 3 weeks for what his employer described as excessive murmuring to himself and inability to follow commands. Neighbors claimed he still woke at sunset and walked to the shore each night, staring out toward Eddystone for hours. One of them recorded that he still kept the lantern lit at home and polished it every morning. Some keepers fared better. Josiah Bray, whose journals formed much of the documentation for Eddystone's middle years, settled into a quiet life as a carpenter and part-time weather reader for Trinity House. He never married. His letters to the Trinity House archives, preserved in careful handwriting, often included commentary on wind pressure, sea temperature, and the behavior of migratory birds. Though his hands were said to tremble, his observations were accurate. Enough to be used in regional shipping forecasts decades later, there's evidence that some former keepers developed quiet kind of reverence for the sea, not as something to be conquered, but as a thing to be understood, endured. One wrote that life in the tower gave him a long patience. Another said, after you live with the sea as your clock and your voice, you find the rest of the world always shouting. These were men who had lived outside the clamor of the town bell, the gossip of neighbors, the urgent pace of city work. The pace they knew was slower, measured by oil burned and waves counted. Yet not all found peace. A man identified only as Keeper Hetch, his full name erased or never recorded, was found destitute in Portsmouth some years after leaving service. He had reportedly become convinced that the light at Eddystone had gone out and that he alone could restore it. When brought before local authorities for disturbing a church service by shouting, "She's dark, she's gone dark," he was not jailed, but instead sent to a poorhouse. There, he was given a corner of the garden to tend. According to a nurse, he spent hours arranging white pebbles in concentric rings, mimicking the layout of a lighthouse lantern, Trinity House, despite its institutional rigidity, eventually began taking greater note of the psychological effects of lighthouse work. By the turn of the 19th century, basic rotation reforms were introduced. No keeper was to serve longer than 8 weeks without shore leave. New lighthouses were built with better ventilation, improved sleeping quarters, and in some cases, small libraries of books. But these changes came after a generation had already endured the earlier standards men, who had spent months at a time locked in the swirl of wind, salt, and the same creaking footsteps on stone. Eddystone's own story would evolve. The lighthouse built by Smeaton stood proud till 1877, when it was found that the rocks beneath it were eroding. It was dismantled stone by stone and a new lighthouse constructed nearby. Portions of the original structure were moved to Plymouth Hoe, where they stand today as a historical monument. But what that monument does not show, what no plaque records, is the internal history of those who kept it alive. There are no statues of lighthouse keepers, no portraits hung in national galleries. Most names are lost to time, their logbooks, perhaps surviving only as artifacts of clerical routine. Yet for over a century, men risked their lives and minds to maintain a single flame. They did this not for fame or fortune, both were absent, but because it had to be done. Without them, ships would vanish into the dark, and ships still did, even with the light. Eddystone could not prevent all wrecks, but for each ship that made it safely through, an invisible line was drawn between the land and sea, thanks to a man polishing glass or climbing icy stairs in the middle of the night. Even today, the role of the lighthouse keeper, now largely automated, holds a kind of quiet dignity. But in the 18th century, it was not romantic. It was wet, cold, repetitive, and at times harrowing. It required endurance, not heroism, faithfulness, not brilliance, and above all, a willingness to fade into the background, knowing that your labor might never be seen, but that the light would dot in the end. What do we remember of those who lived in towers above the sea, their boots damp, their hands calloused, their eyes fixed on a single beam of light? They left no manifestos, led no armies, and shaped no laws. But in the darkness, they kept watch. That, perhaps, is its own kind of legacy, and yet one wonders when the last keeper left the lighthouse, when automation came and the final lamp was lit by machine. Did the tower sigh in relief, or did it mourn the silence of footsteps that would no longer echo up its spiral stairs? Story 2. The Fog Watchers of Small's Reef. A Signal Bell and Two Men. Section 1. Rocks, Routine, and the Bell That Never Stopped Small's Reef. Lying roughly 20 miles west of St. David's Head off the Pembrokeshire coast of Wales, is not a place many would choose to linger. Barely more than jagged teeth of rock protruding from the Irish Sea, the reef is invisible at high tide and hostile in all conditions. In calm weather, it is wet and wind-scoured. In storms, it is a death sentence. By the late 18th century, the British Admiralty had lost enough ships on these hidden rocks to warrant action. And so, in 1776, a lighthouse was ordered to be built. On Smalls, what followed was one of the more quietly haunting episodes in the long and solitary history of lighthouse keeping. Smalls Lighthouse was unlike others. There was no nearby landfall, no mainland in sight. Instead of solid stone like Eddystone, its construction was wooden, a peculiar structure of octagonal shape, raised high above the reef on spindly stilts of timber, as if it had been delicately balanced rather than built. The keepers were perched in a room at the top, 80 feet above the swirling sea, surrounded on all sides by nothing but horizon and gulls. The entire structure groaned when the waves crashed. It was, in essence, a house on stilts in the middle of the sea. From its earliest days, the small station posed unique challenges. Resupply was difficult. Wind conditions made it hazardous. To bring boats close to the rocks, communication was nearly impossible. Trinity House, by now aware of the psychological pressures of lighthouse service, insisted that Smalls be manned by 2 keepers at a time, with rotation schedules kept as regular as the weather would allow. But in 1801, one such rotation would be disastrously interrupted. 2 men were sent to serve a standard 4-week shift at Smalls. Their names were Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith, a pairing that, even before disaster, had been known to quarrel. Both were experienced keepers. Howell was older and known to be methodical, even rigid. Griffith, somewhat younger, was said to be easygoing, but at times inattentive. It was not an ideal match. They had previously worked together at St. Anne's Head, and tension had followed them. Still, they accepted the posting to Smalls, perhaps assuming the proximity of danger would outweigh personal annoyance. The first few days followed routine. Logs were updated daily, lamp lit at dusk, oil level checked, wind NNW, 12 knots. The Bell Smalls signature fog signal was struck at regular intervals when visibility fell. The constant ringing was both a reassurance and a torment. "It speaks when no one can see," Howell once wrote, "and it never sleeps." The keepers cleaned, mended, rationed food, and monitored weather. The sea was unusually calm, a deception they would later regret. Roughly 2 weeks into their rotation, Griffith fell ill. The details remain unclear, perhaps food poisoning, perhaps an untreated infection or injury. There was no doctor, no radio, and no way to signal shore. Howell noted Griffith's deteriorating condition in the logbook. At first, it was fatigue, then vomiting, then silence. Howell wrote on the 5th day of Griffith's sickness, "He speaks no more, breath weak. I pray the boat comes soon." The supply boat did not come. Storms gathered. A gale from the northwest closed the sea routes, delaying the relief crew. Days passed, then weeks. Griffith died, but the real horror had not yet begun. Fearful that authorities would accuse him of murder, given the known quarrels between them, Howell did not throw the body overboard, as was sometimes done in such cases. Instead, he secured the corpse in a makeshift coffin, reportedly fashioned from floorboards and rope. He then lashed the box to the outside railing of the lighthouse, as far from the living quarters as possible. Still, the structure groaned and swayed, and the coffin scraped the wood with every wind-blown gust. It is said, though never officially confirmed, that the coffin came partially loose during a storm. From the living quarters above, Howell could see its swinging arms falling out, the lid cracked, rope fraying. He could not sleep. He could not eat. He recorded in the log that the box mocked him. Each night, the lantern had to be lit, the bell had to be sounded, and Howell had to walk the platform where the coffin swayed in the wind like a warning. Meanwhile, ashore, The delay of the relief crew was noted with concern. When the storms finally broke several weeks after Griffith's death, the relief boat launched. Upon arrival, they found Howell gaunt, pale, and nearly catatonic. The lamp was still burning. The fog bell had been sounded regularly. The logbook was filled with orderly entries, then jagged writing, then blank pages. The body was removed. Howell was returned to land and, after a brief inquiry, cleared of any wrongdoing. He never served again. In later years, when asked what he remembered, he reportedly said only, "The sea talks louder when no one answers back." This episode prompted an immediate change in policy. From that day forward, Trinity House mandated that no lighthouse would ever be manned by fewer than 3 people. A simple, quiet rule born of tragedy. But in that moment, in the shadow of Small's Reef, with the wind keening through wooden beams and the sea rising and falling around him, one man kept the light on. He kept the bell ringing. And no one saw it dotted. It's tempting to imagine a kind of peace in solitude. But what happens when solitude becomes confinement and duty turns into obsession? When your only companion is the memory of a quarrel and a coffin that will not stay still? Section 2. Silence at the edge of the sea. When the relief crew finally reached Small's Lighthouse in 1801, the wind had dropped to a low murmur, and the sea lay deceptively calm its quiet surface, belying the weeks of turmoil that it kept there. Small supply vessel trapped ashore. They had been delayed by violent gales and poor visibility, unable to risk the journey across 20 nautical miles of open sea. But what they found upon arrival was far from routine. Keeper Thomas Howell, once orderly and clear-minded, was a thin, trembling figure. His eyes were sunken, and his beard overgrown. He did not speak at first. He simply pointed to the side of the lighthouse. There, hanging by a length of fraying rope, was the coffin, its boards warped by spray, one arm exposed to the elements, swinging slowly in the sea wind. The men were struck speechless. Only the cry of distant gulls broke the moment. This was not just a failed rotation. It was a slow collapse of the human mind, a demonstration of what happens when fear, isolation, and duty collide in a place that was never meant for men to inhabit. In the days that followed, Howell was taken to the mainland and treated by a local physician. He spoke only intermittently, muttering about the bell, the wind, and Griffith's outstretched hand. A formal inquiry cleared him of any wrongdoing. The records show that the investigating officer found no signs of violence or neglect. But in his personal notes, he described Howell as hollowed out by silence, kept alive by repetition. Indeed, this detailed repetition was what made lighthouse life both endurable and dangerous. The unchanging routine was intended to preserve sanity. Wake, check the oil, strike the bell, clean the glass, light the lamp. But when one of those steps became tangled with trauma, the cycle no longer offered comfort. It became a trap. Howell had kept the routine going far beyond what could reasonably be expected. According to his logbook, now preserved in the archives of Trinity House, he continued to ring the fog bell every half hour, even as storms battered the structure. His entries became erratic. Bell struck at 1:30. Fog persists. Oil used 1.5 pints. Thomas is still there. The bell, struck by hand in Howell's time, must have sounded through gales and fog like a ghost calling for help that never came. There was no mechanism to relieve lighthouse keepers early in such weather. Trinity House was reliant on small, manually powered boats, often operated by local fishermen who knew the waters well. These men were brave, but not reckless. In the face of storms, they waited. This delay, in the case of Smalls, may have lasted over 3 weeks past the intended relief. Date: 3 weeks, alone with a corpse, in a wooden tower that shuddered and groaned with every wave. The structure itself amplified the psychological burden. Small's lighthouse in 1801 was built not for comfort, but for visibility. The keeper's quarters were small, just 8 feet across, and elevated high on timber legs that made the whole tower sway under pressure. The wind howled through gaps in the wood. Sea spray froze on the railings in winter. It was said that on certain nights, the groaning of the timbers could sound like voices. Though the phrase Small's Lighthouse Tragedy would later be coined in local newspapers, the term fails to capture the slow, grinding nature of what Howell experienced. This was not a single catastrophic event, but a series of subtle deteriorations. He lost sleep, then language, then perhaps time. The logbook entries suggest that toward the end, Howell was no longer writing the actual date, but repeating the one he believed it still was. After the incident, Howell did not return to lighthouse service. He reportedly moved inland to a village near Carmarthen, where he worked as a repairman and lived quietly for the remainder of his life. He never married and rarely spoke of his time on Smalls. When asked, he would say only, "The bell rings when it's needed, that's all." The event caused more than just a procedural update. It led to a broader conversation, quiet and bureaucratic, but significant within Trinity House, about the psychological demands of lighthouse keeping. The rule of 3 was implemented almost immediately. From that point forward, at least 3 men would be stationed at any offshore lighthouse. This added redundancy reduced the chances of mental breakdown and allowed for one man to take rest while the other 2 handled duties or crisis. The lighthouse itself underwent inspection. The wooden tower was deemed inadequate for long-term use, both structurally and in terms of humane conditions. Though it would not be replaced until the 1860s, engineers began designing stronger offshore lights that would use stone foundations and improved ventilation. At the time, though, wooden towers like Smalls were all that could be constructed on reefs too, shallow or unstable for heavier materials. The story filtered through maritime circles in whispers and fragments. Among lighthouse crews, it became a kind of cautionary tale spoken of only in pieces. "Don't end up like Smalls," some said. Others avoided saying Griffith's name altogether, referring only to the man in the box. Despite the traumatic event, lighthouse work remained in demand. Pay was reliable, and during times of economic hardship, particularly among fishing communities, steady employment mattered more than comfort. But from 1801 onward, applications began to include informal interviews where senior officers would evaluate temperament. Men who were overly gregarious or too quiet were sometimes passed over. Trinity House did not have the language of modern psychology, but it had learned, through tragedy, the signs of fragility. Perhaps the most overlooked part of the Small story is how little was made of it at the time. A small mention in the Cambrian newspaper. A single inquiry. No public ceremony, no official mourning. Griffith's death was recorded in shipping logs, but his burial place is unknown. The focus, quietly but firmly, was placed on institutional reform rather than public grief. This, too, was typical of the period. The work of lighthouse keepers was considered background labor necessary, but invisible. And yet, the story endured. Among the keepers themselves, it became folklore. Some believed that the tower remained haunted. Others kept small talismans, a smooth stone from Small's Reef, or a piece of rope tied in remembrance. In the fog, when the bell rang, some claimed they could still hear a second echo. It's worth asking, why did Howell not jump? Why did he not flee or abandon the lamp? Surely the world would have forgiven him, but to abandon the lamp was to abandon the purpose of the tower. Ships still passed. Lives still depended on the light. Howell may have feared many things: accusation, madness, the corpse's hand tapping against the wood, but more than anything, he feared the dark. Section 3. Light beyond the wreckage by. At time the Smalls lighthouse incident faded from active memory, it had already reshaped a small but vital corner of maritime history. The two Thomases Howell and Griffith became less real over time and more symbolic. Their story was rarely recorded in full. Instead, it lingered in the quiet corners of lighthouse service, half cautionary tale, half professional parable, told in mess halls and signal huts when the sea was loud and the sky low. Yet behind the folklore remained a stark reality. Two men went out, and only one came back whole. The lighthouse itself stood for decades more, a spindly survivor of storms and salt. Its wooden frame groaned louder with each passing year, and keepers posted there after 1801 often reported an uneasy feeling when stationed atop it. Some claimed to hear tapping during windless nights. Others, less prone to superstition, simply noted that the tower moved too much to sleep soundly. Still, with its fog bell ringing and its oil lamp lit, it fulfilled its duty. Smalls warned ships away from the jagged reef, and no further tragedies of that kind occurred. At least, not there. In 1861, the wooden tower was finally replaced by a sturdier, more humane structure. The new Smalls Lighthouse was constructed of granite, using design elements pioneered by John Smeaton and adapted to the specific challenges of the Irish Sea. It stood lower than its predecessor, but was built like a fortress. The living quarters, still Spartan, were improved. Better ventilation, storage, and sleeping arrangements. Most importantly, it adhered strictly to the new three-keeper rule. The legacy of Howell's trauma thus lived on not in monuments, but in blueprints. Lighthouse keeping remained an austere occupation throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, though growing awareness of mental health, however primitive, led to marginal improvements. Shore leaves became more frequent. Letters could be exchanged more reliably. Rotations were better managed, and supervision subtle but consistent ensured that psychological strain was noted early, if not well understood. Still, the silence of the sea never softened. Fog continued to swallow the horizon. Bells rang into nothingness, and in towers like Smalls, keepers continued to perform their duties in isolation. Often, that meant waiting for the sun to set, for the supply boat to appear, for the next task, no matter how minor, to arrive. What's most striking about this life is its scale, not the dramatic or catastrophic, but the measured and meticulous. At Smalls, every keeper had a schedule. Trim the lamp, strike the bell. Clean the lens, log the wind. It was, in essence, a life lived by inches. But it was in those inches that ships were guided safely, lives preserved from splintering hulls and cold seawater. The bell that Howell rang so religiously, day and night, still exists in art. Its components were recovered during later renovations, and while the metal had rusted and the clapper was lost, the main frame was preserved. It now rests in a maritime museum in Pembrokeshire. Visitors walk past it slowly, reading a plaque. That summarizes the tragedy in just a few brief lines. In memory of those who kept the light at Smalls. May the sea remember their watch. No mention is made of the coffin. As for Howell himself, history leaves him in a gentle fade. After his discharge, he lived in relative anonymity. Census records list him as a tradesman, but the specific work varies by year, sometimes tinsmith, sometimes lamp repairer. One entry from 1819 lists him simply as laborer. He lived alone in a modest cottage, not far from the sea. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, and always punctual. He was known to walk the coastline at dusk, stopping at specific points to watch the horizon as if waiting for something to rise from it. It's tempting to read too much into these behaviors. But perhaps the truth is simpler. After all, Howell had spent a portion of his life with only the sea as his companion. The sound of gulls, the rhythmic crash of water against rock, the creak of timbers in wind. These were the conditions that had shaped his most intense memories. Returning to a world of dry streets and chatter must have felt at times like returning to a dream that no longer belonged to him. His death in 1829 passed quietly. No obituary was printed. He left behind no known family. But he did leave behind one possession of note, a handwritten notebook found among his belongings and passed on to the local lighthouse inspector out of curiosity. The notebook is spare half filled with sea logs, weather patterns, and what appears to be Morse code practice, though Morse itself wouldn't be standardized until decades later. The final entry, dated just a few months before his death, reads, "Only, the sea still rings, the bell still waits." Today, automation has replaced nearly every human aspect of lighthouse work. Small's lighthouse has no keepers. Its light is powered by solar panels. Its weather sensors feed data into satellites. Its foghorn sounds not by hand, but by signal. There are no meals shared in silence, no boots drying by the stove, no logs. Scrawled in trembling hands at midnight dot, and yet, in some deep way, the quiet legacy of Thomas Howell still lingers. His story stripped of drama, shaped by endurance, reminds us that history is not only made by generals, kings, or inventors. Sometimes it is shaped by men who wait, who endure, who strike the bell when the sea is thick with fog and the world forgets they are even there. That we tend to remember the dramatic, the shipwrecks, the storms, the wreckage. But the stories that mattered most, especially to the ships that passed safely in the dark, were the ones in which nothing happened. Because someone quietly, persistently, perhaps trembling, made sure that the light stayed on, and as the waves roll on past the now empty tower at Small's Reef, one might still ask, if a bell rings out to sea with no keeper to strike it, do we still owe something to the hand that once did? Story 3. The Salt Rakers of Lymington. Brine, Backaches, and Britain's Forgotten Gold. Section 1. A landscape crusted in white hue. Are standing at the edge of the Lymington marshes in southern England. In the early summer of 1721. There's no breeze this morning, only the thick scent of wet mud and brine. The sun hasn't yet burned through the haze, and what you see before you is not snow or frost, though it might look like that in the low light but salt. Fields of it glistening and pale, layered across an eerie checkerboard of square wooden. Pens and dark wooden frames. You are here to make salt, not to mine it or boil it, or even trade it yet, but to rake it, dry it, and pack it into barrels 1 spoonful at a time. Your hands, if they were not already calloused, will soon blister. Your knees, even beneath wool, will be caked with sharp little crusts by the end of the day. There is no shade, and there will be no change in scenery. You are a salt raker of Lymington, and this is what you will do every day, from sunrise until moonrise, for as long as your back can hold out. The salt marshes of Lymington were not a glamorous place. There were no battles fought here, no speeches made, and no monuments built to mark the work. But for over 3 centuries, this network of shallow pans, sluice gates, and wind pumps formed the backbone of Britain's quiet obsession with salt, an obsession driven not by taste, but by preservation. Before refrigeration, salt was power. It preserved food, kept armies marching, and enabled long voyages by sea. Salted cod could feed a fleet. Salted pork kept for weeks. Cheese hardened with brine. Even butter was packed in salt. So those who controlled salt, its production, storage, and trade held an outsized influence in the balance of daily life. The town of Lymington, perched along the southern Hampshire coast, was one of many such producers. But unlike the deep rock salt mines of Cheshire or the massive evaporation fields of France, Lymington's method was painstakingly manual. It relied on the particular shape of the English coastline, the strong tides of the Solent, and the delicate, choreography of wind and sun. There were no vast salt deserts here, just shallow clay pans and a system of causeways, sluices, and ditches that managed the flow of brine through a precisely timed sequence. You started with seawater, drawn into a first set of reservoirs via tide and pump. From there, it was allowed to sit and settle in large evaporating ponds, gradually concentrating into stronger brine. As the water thickened with salt, it was transferred to smaller pans, known as crystalline pans, where the final evaporation took place. That was where the rakers came in. Each morning, salt workers like you entered the crystallizing pans with long wooden rakes, dragging the forming salt into neat rows, allowing it to dry further before collection. The process was labor-intensive and delicate. Step wrong and the pan could crack. Pull too hard and you wasted product. Leave the salt too long, and impurities, clay, dust, sea scum would mix in, rendering the batch unfit for trade. You worked barefoot or in crude sandals. Your legs stung from the brine. Your back ached from the constant bending and twisting. The salt lodged in your fingernails, your eyelids, your ears. It got everywhere. At night, when you lay down to sleep, your skin was dry and tight. Your clothes, if you wore them more than one day, became stiff with crusted salt, like you were wearing burlap dipped in SNOWMELT. The irony was, salt was expensive, but salt work was not profitable for the laborers. You were paid by the barrel, and barrels were not easy to fill. The marshes had good years and bad years. Too much rain ruined production. Too much wind disturbed the evaporation. Too much sun made the pans overheat and burst their clay linings. In a good week, a raker might help produce several barrels and receive a modest share. In a bad week, the work went on, but the coin did not follow. Salt merchants made money. Landowners profited. But the workers, often families who had lived near the marshes for generations, were tied to the work by familiarity, if not by opportunity. It was a seasonal rhythm. Salt in summer, odd jobs in winter. Boys learned from fathers, and daughters, too, joined in the raking, drying, and packing. And this work didn't exist in isolation. It formed the spine of a wider local economy. Cooperages boomed near Leamington to supply the ever-hungry demand for barrels. Horses were hired out to haul the salt inland, where it would reach markets as far as London. Barges loaded with white crystal lined the harbor. Even taverns benefited, feeding the sore-armed workers and housing the traveling traders who came to inspect the product. If you lived in Leamington, you were part of the salt cycle, one way or another. The English government, too, kept a close watch. Salt was taxable, and because it was essential, it was taxed often. The salt tax became a source of both income and unrest for the crown. Smuggling was rampant, especially along the southern coast, where boats could slip between marshes and estuaries with relative ease. Whole families, it was whispered, worked as much for smugglers as for the official salt lords. Small barrels marked as damaged or spoiled would be hidden among the loads, spirited off the docks by moonlight, and sold inland at a steep discount. But even beyond the tax and trade, the work itself was what left its mark. Some of the salt workers of Leamington kept diaries, simple logbooks of weather, water levels, and brine quality. A few of these still survive in regional archives. One such entry from the summer of 1743 reads, "Sun strong all week, brine thick and brittle. Took 7 rakes to break the crust. Marta fell in again, cut foot. 2 barrels finished by Friday. Another, more worn by time, from 1767, clouds heavy. No draw from the tide, men idle but restless. Watched the windmills turn, but brought no good. Paid half wages and bought no meat." These fragments, dry and matter-of-fact, capture the emotional terrain of salt work as well as any poem or memoir could. They speak of effort unspooled across endless repetition, of labor tied to the whims of weather, and of lives carved out under skies heavy with salt air and responsibility docked by the late 18th century. Lymington's salt industry began to decline. Competition from Cheshire's deeper rock mines, along with changes in trade routes and increased importation of cheaper continental salt, made the slow marsh process less viable. Steam power and rail lines shifted the geography of economic importance. Inland. By the early 1800s, many of the pans were abandoned, overgrown, or repurposed for grazing animals, but traces of that life remained. The outlines of the salt pans can still be seen from aerial photographs. The ditches and sluices, though silted, mark the fields in strange geometric patterns, ghosts of labor once drawn by hand. And here and there, a crumbling wooden rake or fragment of a barrel stave might still turn up in the mud. If you walk there today, at low tide, and pause in the stillness, you might imagine what it was like. The glare of sun on salt, the cry of gulls overhead, the rhythmic scrape of wood on crystal. You might imagine a child's laughter quickly stifled by a stern warning not to slip. You might see a woman with sleeves rolled high, carrying a heavy basket to the dry shed. And you might wonder, how did they do this? Day after day, year after year? That's the real question about Lymington's salt rakers, not how they did it, but why they kept on. What compels a person to work the earth, or in this case, the sea, in such a slow, repetitive way? Is it survival? Tradition? Pride? Or something else, something quieter and harder to name? The salt was never the point. It was the life around the salt, the labor, the fatigue, the shared understanding that bound these people to their place in history. A history not written in triumphs or wars, but in barrels, rakes, and tides. Section 2. Smugglers, salt barons, and the price of purity. In the brittle light of dawn, Lymington's salt pans shimmer like a dream, or perhaps like a mirage. But as the years pressed into the middle of the 18th century, a new tension crept along the coast. Not in the salt itself, but in the flow of money, control, and law. Salt, once the quiet concern of tide watchers and rakers, now drew the gaze of tax collectors, traders, and coastal inspectors. A drama still hushed, still slow was beginning to UNS Pool. At the heart of this tension was the salt tax, formally introduced in the 1690s, and continually increased throughout the 1700s. Intended as a convenient and consistent source of crown revenue, the tax quickly became a burden for ordinary producers. Every barrel of salt, whether destined for the kitchen or the curing shed, had to be accounted for and marked. Salt stores were subject to inspection, and producers needed a license to transport their goods beyond their town limits, to Lymington's. Workers, these regulations turned an already back-breaking job into a dance of caution and record-keeping. Every grain of salt now carried a number, a rate, a watchful eye. An industry once ruled by weather and water was now also ruled by ink, ledgers, and the men who kept them. But paper is easier to fool than the tide. As the tax rose, so did the temptation to sidestep it. By mid-century, salt smuggling had become not just an occasional crime, but a quiet industry of its own. Along the Hampshire coast, especially in places like Lymington, Milford, and Cahaven, a nighttime economy developed, one that slipped past docks, hid beneath eel nets, and moved by moonlight. Smuggling in Lymington was rarely dramatic. There were no pitched sea battles or masked riders here. Instead, it took place in the hush of routine. A barrel marked as spoiled, but in truth perfectly pure. A delivery diverted not to Southampton, but to a small barn outside Brockenhurst. A fisherman's boat that carried more than just fish when it docked before sunrise. The most common trick was dilution. A merchant might record 6 barrels as half crystallized, 2 wet and too impure to be taxed at the full rate, when in fact they were clean and dry. Another tactic was substitution, placing decoy barrels in the front of a cart while hiding the real product, beneath layers of seaweed or oyster shells. Local lore tells of entire families who coordinated these efforts. Grandmothers stirred brine pans while children acted as lookouts, stationed near inlets with whistles or small hand drums. Fathers and uncles moved the product by night, navigating the narrow marsh trails with lanterns dimmed by cloth. These weren't outlaws in the romantic sense, but rather practical people trying to make ends meet under a growing pressure. One diary, kept by a Lymington merchant named Caleb Eames in the 1750s, includes the following. Had word from P at Pennington 2 men, lost to Crown officer on the west track. Left barrels in ditch. Watered down the rest. Paid the boy for silence. That boy was likely no older than 12, of course. Not all salt producers participated in smuggling. Some, particularly those with more land and greater capital, aligned themselves with the Crown's officials. They formed local salt guilds, set regional rates, and lobbied for stricter enforcement against competitors. These were the salt barons, the men who owned multiple pans and who employed dozens of rakers across the season. They often lived in townhouses facing the quay, their windows open to the harbor, where barges loaded under their watch. Barons had more to gain from order and control. Smuggling disrupted their pricing, threatened their reputations, and endangered their ties to major buyers in London or Portsmouth. They hired watchmen, built locked salt houses, and offered bounties for information about illicit trade. Yet even among the wealthier class, the line between legal and illegal was blurry. Some barons sold off their low-quality brine to smugglers who could reprocess it elsewhere. Others turned a blind eye to their workers' wastage, especially when profits were good. The law was cumbersome, and the coast was long. In the end, the difference between an honest merchant and a smuggler often came down to who got caught. It's worth noting that salt itself was not rare. The sea, after all, gave it freely. The scarcity was artificial, imposed by the Crown's desire to manage and profit from its distribution. This artificial scarcity turned the local substance into a national commodity, and like all such transformations, it created tension between the people who produced the resource and those who controlled it. Meanwhile, the cultural presence of salt continued to grow. It appeared in songs, proverbs, and even folk medicine. Worth his salt became a phrase to describe a man of value. Salt was rubbed into wounds and thrown into hearth fires to ward off evil. In churches, it was sometimes mixed into baptismal water. A good housekeeper was expected to keep salt dry and clean. A careless one, who let it clump or yellow, was judged. Salt even shaped how people thought about character. A salty man was not just brined. He was honest, sharp, and perhaps a bit coarse. To share salt with someone was to acknowledge kinship. Salt made the invisible visible. It marked effort, survival, and taste. Lymington, too, bore the marks. Salt was in the streets, in the names of buildings, in the local slang. The pub near the marshes was called the Briny Lad, and its upper room doubled as a place for disputes among salt workers, to be resolved with handshakes, or, when that failed, with fists. Local gravestones sometimes noted the profession. Samuel Tiller, salt rake of Pennington, who labored long and drank little. 1732. These weren't grand memorials. They were practical, short, and enduring like the work itself, by the 1770s. However, it was becoming clear that Lymington's golden years of salt were numbered. Competition from inland producers, particularly the salt mines in Cheshire, was making evaporation-based production less viable. The inland salt could be produced year-round, unaffected by weather, and shipped more efficiently thanks to improved canal networks. At the same time, the increasing burden of taxation and regulation made small-scale marsh work less attractive. Fewer families passed the trade to their children. More young men left for work in larger towns or aboard ships. And the government, noticing the decline, began to shift its attention elsewhere. By 1798, the salt tax was repealed in Part 2. Late to save many of the coastal works that had already closed, salt production in Leamington lingered into the early 1800s in a reduced form. A few loyal rakers kept working the pans, either out of habit, pride, or a lack of alternatives. But by mid-century, the marshes had mostly fallen silent. The wooden wind pumps rotted in place. The sluices grew thick with reeds. Salt, once the lifeblood of the town, became its echo. And yet, Leamington survived. The town reinvented itself in the 19th century as a center of shipbuilding and coastal trade. Tourists came for the clean air and the views of the Isle of Wight. The salt pans, now overgrown, became wildlife habitats. But beneath the changes lay the memory of labor, the invisible history crusted in white, shaped by tides, taxes, and a determination so quiet it nearly vanished, that it begins with a flatness, quiet so complete it might be mistaken for emptiness. To walk the marshes outside Leamington today is to step into a landscape stripped of noise, save for the wind, the shuffle of reeds, and the long whistles of seabirds. But if you look closely, just closely enough, the ghost of a vanished industry flickers in the grass. Most visitors don't see it. They stroll along the raised paths, watching the tide creep in and out with a kind of timeless rhythm. They admire the distant sailboats, the scattered gulls, the slow-turning sky. Some might pause to read a plaque by the shore, perhaps one that mentions salt production as a historical curiosity, a footnote to the broader story of the Hampshire coast. But beneath the turf and water lies the geometry of labor. Here and there, the faint outlines of salt pans still hold their shape, long, rectangular depressions, barely perceptible unless the sun hits them just right. Overgrown by grasses and hemmed by sedge, they form a kind of accidental map. To those who know what to look for, the patterns are unmistakable. The evaporation beds, the windmill foundations, the sluices that once governed the sea's arrival. Like a ticking clock. In some spots, old wooden sluice posts still protrude from the mud gray, splintered, weathered smooth by decades of rain. Iron nails, rusted beyond recognition, lie buried under inches of silt. Children, clambering through the marsh, sometimes mistake them for driftwood or fence stakes. But these were the bones of an industry, rough-hewn, soaked in brine, forgotten. The salt rakers left, or rather, when they faded from the land, it was not with ceremony. There were no parades or plaques, no final barrels loaded with fanfare. The work simply ceased. A pan fell out of use. A rake was left leaning against a post. A wind pump stopped turning and was never repaired. The last rakers likely knew it was ending. Perhaps they even preferred it that way. For generations, salt work had meant dawns in cold water, skin cracked with brine, backs bent under sacks. Few mourned the labor, though some may have mourned the rhythm. The sea, after all, had ordered their days for centuries. In a small churchyard near Pennington, one headstone stands apart, not because it is grand, but because of the words carved into its soft stone. Thomas Noakes, raker of salt, who walked the marsh in sun and gale, and bore his labor with quiet faith, died 1811. The epitaph is unusually personal for the period. There's no mention of property or title, no list of descendants. Just a trade and a kind of resilience. We don't know much about Thomas Noakes. No letters of his survive. No portraits. But the phrasing suggests something enduring, that the work itself, anonymous and repetitive as it was, shaped a person's sense of worth, and in some quiet way earned remembrance. Others weren't remembered at all. Women who tended boiling houses, boys who watched the sluices, old men who kept the ledgers by candlelight. Their names are mostly gone, carried away on wet wind. But they were there. And the land remembers Dot by the mid-19th century, most of Lymington's. Former salt pans had become part of the landscape, now known as the Lymington and Cahaven marshes. What had once been industrial land was slowly reclaimed by nature. Birds nested in the pans. Reeds grew where brine once steamed. The sea reasserted its claim, smoothing the scars left by rake and shovel. Ironically, the same features that made the saltworks' productive flatness, tidal control, isolation, also made them perfect for conservation. Today, the area is designated as a Site of Special Scientific Interest, SSI, valued for its biodiversity. Marsh harriers wheel overhead. Egrets pick along the shallows. The salt marsh flora, once an annoyance to workers, is now carefully catalogued. And so, the land lives two lives, one of labor, one of leisure, one remembered, one ongoing. There are few written records of individual salt workers, but the town's memory clings to fragments. In the Lymington Museum, tucked among nautical maps and Victorian crockery, there is a battered wooden rake, its handle worn smooth, its tines still faintly crusted. A nearby panel explains its use, though the language is dry. It says nothing. Of the long mornings, the salt cracked in the folds of skin, the smell of brine that never quite left the hair. Locals still tell the occasional story. An old fisherman might recall his grandfather mentioning the ghost carts of the marsh creaking wheels heard on foggy nights, though no one passed. Children dare one another to walk alone through the paths after dark, whispering tales of lost rakers and salt smugglers still roaming with lanterns lit. Of course, most of it is legend. But legends often hang on truths. Perhaps the greatest truth is this: salt made Lymington matter. For over a century, it gave the town purpose, identity, trade, and trouble. It carved its routines into the community like wind shaping stone slowly, invisibly but permanently. And though the industry is gone, its imprint remains not in grand monuments, but in the quiet details: a pattern in the reeds, a rake in a museum, a phrase in an epitaph. Even the language of the town carries echoes. To take it with a pinch of salt, after all, is to retain skepticism. But for those who labored here, salt was certainty. It was daily, physical, hard-won. There was no metaphor in it dotted low. Tide, when the sun cuts across the marsh at a shallow angle, the water turns silver, and the flats glisten faintly. For a moment, it almost looks like salt again. Not in the industrial sense, but in the way memory crystallizes, gradually, imperceptibly, yet with surprising sharpness when the light is just right. Story 4. Clocks, Candle Marks, and the Keeper's Ledger. How Time Was Kept at Aylin Glass. Section 1. The lighthouse that counted the hours. It was a strange thing to live by time when the sea knew none. The men who manned the Aylin Glass Lighthouse in the late 18th century stood at the edge of the known, the rhythmic, and the recordable, perched on a narrow peninsula on the Isle of Scalpe in the Outer Hebrides. The lighthouse rose like a pale finger from the rock, constant against the sweep of wind and tide. Its lamp oil fed and faint by modern standards pierced the dark with a stuttering hope, guiding vessels through the dangerous sound of Chiant. Where fog and reefs colluded with deadly precision. It was not the sea that ruled life here, but the measurement of it. This story begins not with shipwrecks or storms, but with time. Specifically, the quiet tyranny of keeping it. When Aylin Glass was first lit in 1789, one of the earliest to do so under the newly established Northern Lighthouse Board, it brought not only illumination to passing vessels, but an entirely new way of living for its keepers. Time in the lighthouse was not a fluid thing like the weather or tides. It was measured, documented, verified, and crucially, it was observed. Each keeper was responsible for maintaining the light in 6-hour shifts, turning the reflectors, trimming the wicks, replenishing the oil, and most importantly, logging their actions. The light had to burn from sunset to sunrise without fail. If it dimmed even briefly, ships might founder on the rocks. The smallest lapse could mean death for others, far from shore, unknown until the wreckage washed up. This responsibility gave rise to a kind of sacred attention. The keepers, living in rotation in a stone cottage near the tower, structured their entire lives around candle marks and bell strikes. There were no clocks in the traditional sense, at least not until the early 1800s, and even then, they were expensive and temperamental. Instead, timekeeping relied on keen eyes, astronomical charts, and a strict set of instructions issued by the board. The original lighthouse manual was a marvel of both clarity and dullness. Pages were devoted to the exact timing of wick trimming. Every hour, the distance between oil refills, every 2 hours, and the precise angle at which to set the polished reflectors to maximize light dispersal. One keeper later described the routine as devotional monotony and meant it as praise. To live at. Alien glass was to disappear into a structure of time. Keepers recorded their actions in ledgers, now housed in the archives of the Northern Lighthouse Board in Edinburgh. Their entries are brief, factual, almost painfully uneventful. And yet, in those neat rows of inked notations, the rhythms of their isolated world emerge. 8 p.m. wick trimmed. Weather calm. 10 p.m. refilled oil. Sky overcast. 12 midnight, light steady. Observed vessel passing west. 2 a.m. rain, light easterly wind. No ship sighted. Every 6 hours, without fail, the lightkeeper noted what had occurred, and more often, what had not. These books were not just logs. They were a kind of proof of vigilance, a bulwark against accusation, and the lighthouse's only testimony that it had done its silent work. The sea may have had its own clock tides and currents, stars and moonblood. The keeper's watch was man-made, deliberate, and exacting. What makes this story so compelling in its stillness is how ordinary it all was. The glamour of the lighthouse, such as it was, came not from drama, but from endless predictability. In fact, boredom was part of the job description. Excitement was failure. A smashed lens, a missed refill, a ship seen too close. The lighthouse's daily operations revolved around oil whale oil, initially. The thick, viscous substance was stored in casks, hauled up steep, slippery stairs, and poured into reservoirs. It burned with a smoky brightness, leaving residue that had to be scraped away, hour after hour. The keepers wore smocks that became stiff with oil and soot. The smell of the stuff never left their skin. This daily interaction with the machinery of time refilling, logging, adjusting was laborious, but meditative. More than one keeper reportedly took pride in the quiet perfection of a well-maintained lens. Polishing brass became an art form. Some even made small etchings in the metal bases, initials, dates, marks of presence. There were no breaks, no off days. Even in storms, even in snow, even when a keeper was sick or when a child cried in the next room, the light had to be tended. And more importantly, it had to be recorded. One entry from 1796 reads, "Storm at noon. Chimney breached in quarters. Light undisturbed. Maintained by hand through high gusts." Another from 1803. "Assistant fell ill. Suspected ague. Continued rotation alone. Oil usage within expected range." Such entries don't tell stories in the traditional sense. But in their silence, they reveal a kind of quiet endurance. These men were not lauded heroes. They were salaried workers in wool coats and oiled boots, scribbling notes in cold rooms by the flicker of the very light they tended. Their isolation was near complete. Scalpay was barely accessible by boat in winter, and the headland of Ailinn. Glass even less so. Supply ships came sporadically. Letters, if they arrived at all, might take weeks. It was not uncommon for keepers to spend entire seasons with only one or two others for company men they might not have chosen, but with whom they shared a professional silence. There was no romantic lens flashing in this. No grand gestures. Just routine, repeated until it became identity. Even sleep was regulated. The 6-hour shifts meant strange patterns. Naps in daylight, waking at midnight, eating porridge in the dark. The rhythm of the body was reshaped by the demands of the light, until, one assumes, the ticking of time became internalized, a bodily fact as much as hunger or breath. Perhaps that is why. In the archives, the logbooks begin to take on a curious personality, not in content, but in form. Some entries are neat and careful. Others, written during storms or illness, slope sideways or trail off. One keeper from 1808, a man named Duncan McCary, began to draw small dots and arrows in the margins, possibly to track passing vessels, possibly as a kind of private code. We don't know. But we know he was there. This was timekeeping not for convenience, but for survival, because at its core, the work of the lighthouse was preventative. A good night meant nothing happened. A perfect night was invisible light burning, ships safe, time logged. And yet, that invisibility was the need. Point. The keeper's entire purpose was to make danger forgettable. As the 18th century turned toward the 19th, lighthouses like Ailinn Glass became symbols of state regulation, of Britain's growing maritime control. But on the ground, or rather, on the rock, it remained a matter of individual attention, measured in lamp oil and ledger ink. The keepers themselves are almost entirely absent from broader history. Few diaries survive, fewer names. Their only legacy, in many cases, is a line in a logbook. But is that not, in a way, timekeeping too? To live a life marked by small notations, factual, repeating, precise, is to leave behind something that resists decay. These pages survive because someone followed the rules every day without fail. And yet one wonders, as the candle burned low and the oil hissed in the lamp, what thoughts passed through the minds of those who watched the sea for ships that might never come? Was it loneliness they felt? Purpose? Or something in between something, measured not in hours, but in the weight of hours? Section 2. Watches within watches. The human cost of precision to read. A lighthouse keeper's logbook from Ailinn Glass is to encounter a peculiar kind of narrative one, where the passage of time is more important than events within it. But behind those clock-like entries lived men with soft eyes, arthritic hands, and minds worn smooth by wind and repetition. As the 18th century drew to a close, lighthouse authorities, then still developing their protocols, grappled with how to ensure keepers remained alert through the long, monotonous watches. At Ailinn Glass, as at other remote lights, the early solution was simple and brutal. Divide time until no one person could forget it. A typical night shift was split into quarters, sometimes as short as 2 or 3 hours, rotated between a principal keeper and his assistant. In winter, that meant 6 to 8 individual shifts per man, interrupted by bursts of sleep, if sleep came at all. The keepers' lives became fragmented, parceled out in little units of duty, like monkish vigils against an invisible encroaching. There were no mechanical alarms in those early years, only oil clocks prone to inaccuracy and the ticking weight of habit. More than one keeper reportedly trained his body to wake precisely on the hour, a talent born from fear rather than skill. Falling asleep during a shift wasn't merely a lapse, it was a potential scandal. A ship dashed on rocks due to a darkened Light could bring inquiry, dismissal, even criminal charges. And so, time lived inside the body dot to help anchor their routine. Keepers often synchronized with external cues. One of the oldest lighthouse superstitions recorded in the oral accounts of 19th century Scottish lightmen was the candle mark. It was believed that a slowly burning candle, notched along its length, could serve as a rough but faithful clock. Set beside the keeper's logbook, it marked both illumination and duration. Some keepers swore by it even after mechanical timepieces became common. Others took to measuring time by the number of steps in their rounds. A full inspection of the tower and quarters, from oil room to light room and back, was counted not in minutes, but in physical cadence. 1 2-minute check might take 170 steps, another 176, depending on weather or fatigue. To the outsider, this seems crude, but for the man inside it, it was exact. This physical relationship with time eventually found strange outlets. There are records quiet, almost incidental, of keepers who began carving notches into the walls of their quarters, not just to mark days, but to create homemade calendars or even track lunar phases for personal rituals. One assistant in 1799, whose name is now lost, etched 28 shallow lines into the underside of his bunk. They aligned perfectly with a month's duration. But if time structured the day, it also deformed it. Many keepers suffered from sleep disorders, though they had no name for them. A condition known as watchman's fatigue was described in a 1797 board report. It included symptoms like memory lapses, headaches, and bouts of hallucination during the dark hours. Some believed it was the oil fumes. Others blamed the clanging fog bell, whose constant mechanical noise activated in low visibility drove at least one keeper to a breakdown. And still, the logs were written. The lens was cleaned. The light was kept. Even the food habits bent around this strange, disjointed clockwork. Meals were not served at traditional hours, but based on shift changes. Breakfast could happen at 4 p.m., dinner at 2 a.m. keepers often boiled oats or stewed salted fish in advance, letting meals simmer on the hearth while they completed their inspections. Time was flavorless. Everything was simply next. One document, a letter from a visiting inspector in 1801, offers a rare glimpse into the human toll. The keeper appears listless but obedient. I found him seated near the oil vats, reading aloud from the book of Psalms, though no one else was present. He startled when I entered, as though forgetting his duty, though he was not neglectful. I believe him to be overspent from solitude and too regular a rotation. It is unclear whether the man was reprimanded. Despite all this, the keepers rarely complained. Or if they did, the complaints didn't survive the archival side of official documentation. What remains are neutral facts: number of hours worked, ounces of oil consumed, weather summaries, vessel sightings, and underneath, invisibly, the weight of the hours. There were rare exceptions, moments where the keeper broke protocol, just enough to hint at interior life. In the log of February 1804. A marginal note in smaller script appears: light serviceable. Heard seals on west side after midnight. Long cry like a child. And a month later, stillness extreme. Clock sound echoed downstairs. Counted my own heartbeats. These aren't confessions, but they are cracks. Little fractures in the official story of pure duty. They show a human being peering out from under the weight of too much regularity, too much perfect time. Not all men endured. There is the story, perhaps apocryphal, of a relief keeper who, after only 3 weeks at Ailen Glass in 1805, left in the middle of a gale and walked 7 miles barefoot to the nearest crofter's house. When asked why, he simply said, "I could not count any more." Whether he meant hours, steps, or storms, no one asked. And yet, for every man who could not stay, There were those who returned year after year, anchored not by passion, but by the comfort of the known. One long-serving keeper, Ian McLeod, spent 28 years in rotation at the lighthouse. He is quoted as saying, in one of the rare interviews of the period, "The clock is the master, but it is a fair one. It wants only what it asks." He died at 61, 2 days after retirement. We do not know how he passed the final night. Section 3. The last night before the chronometer, when time broke down by the early 19th century. The world beyond the lighthouse was changing. Napoleon had fallen. Britain had begun its long march into industrial consolidation. And at sea, a revolution of timekeeping was unfolding. The marine chronometer, a near miraculous instrument of precision, was reshaping how ships navigated and how lighthouses were expected to perform. But at Elan Glass, the tower stood still, tethered to older rhythms. The keepers there had lived by candle marks, footstep cycles, and crude oil clocks for decades. But in 1812, a directive came from the Northern Lighthouse Board in Edinburgh. All manned lights were to transition towards standardized mechanical clocks with improved accuracy, including pendulum-regulated timepieces. These were to be calibrated monthly using observations from traveling inspectors, who themselves would consult maritime chronometers. Elan Glass received its first such clock in December 1812. It was a pendulum model made by a Glasgow horologist named Calder MacBrain. Polished oak case, a glass face, brass hands. It was mounted on the interior wall of the keeper's quarters with instructions printed on heavy paper. Do not wind during storm. Set time only per board instructions. Record discrepancy daily in logbook margin. It ticked with an almost church-like regularity, and its presence marked the beginning of the end of time as felt, and the beginning of time dash as dash commanded at first. The keepers trusted their bodies more than the clock. Principal keeper Archibald Kerr, already nearing 60, continued to rise before each of his night shifts based on habit. He reportedly ignored the new clock for several weeks, insisting that the sea tells me when it's time. He wasn't wrong. At least not at first. The old rhythm still matched the tower's needs. But then came the winter of 1813. January brought what the Edinburgh Gazette called a sustained tempest, a fierce nor'easter that battered the Western Isles for nearly 5 days. The light had to be maintained without fail, but the conditions made everything worse. The winds rattled the tower. Waves crashed hard enough to shake the lens housing. The mechanical clock, never designed for such persistent vibration, lost time. It drifted by minutes, then hours. Kerr noticed. His assistant, a young man named Fergus Lyon, recorded in the log. Clock loses 8 minutes. Wind interferes with pendulum. Kerr resets by guess. A week later, clock nearly stopped. Time approximated by fog bell rhythm. This fog bell another new. Mandate from the board was itself run by a spring mechanism and required winding every 3 hours. But the storm winds distorted its pattern, and in the fog and fatigue, it became almost impossible to distinguish bell from wind owl. Time turned slippery again. Fergus wrote, hesitantly, Kerr believes storm affects body as much as timepiece. Claims the bones tick more true. In that same entry, he noted something unusual. Saw him place small stones on window ledge. 4 stones moved slightly each day. Unknown purpose. Historians speculate Kerr was returning to a physical counting method, possibly matching the moon phase or attempting a crude solar alignment through storm gaps. Others argue it was a symbolic act reasserting human order in a time unmoored by weather and machinery. Whatever the intent, the board was not impressed that an inspector arrived in late February, after the storm had passed. He found the mechanical clock 3 hours behind the official time, and the logbook marked with irregular notes of uncertain chronology. His report is terse. Keeper appears disordered, unshaven, claims no vessel loss due to light, though no corroboration available. Recommends reassignment. Kerr was removed in early March. There is no record of where he went afterward, though an 1816 death notice in Inverness for N.A. Kerr, formerly of the lighthouse service, may refer to him. He was buried with no epitaph. Lyon, his assistant, briefly took over but requested transfer within the year. In a private letter to his cousin, preserved in a family archive, Lyon wrote, "It is not the wind that breaks men here. It is the slow tyranny of minutes. We are made to think by tick and strike, and when the tick stumbles, we fall with it." That winter, the clock was remounted with extra bracing. A backup marine chronometer was issued to Aylen Glass by 1815, kept in a padded box and checked monthly. The logs became more regular, less human. Marginalia vanished. No more notes about seals, no heartbeats counted. Just entries like light, exhibited 5:51 p.m. oil used, 1.25 gallons clock corrected, plus 32 seconds. Age of quiet improvisation. The age of keeping time with the self was over. Yet in the surrounding Hebridean communities, older ideas about time still lingered. Fishermen along the Isle of Scalpe still referred to the second fire of Aylen Glass when noting the turn of night toward dawn. Some said the tower blinked slowly like a tired eye, a phrase recorded by folklorist Meg McInnes in 1823. Her notebook, she captured a tale told by an old crofter. There was once a man who kept the light so long that he no longer knew when he lived. Only the gulls called his name. He walked round the tower until he became the time. This is myth, of course, but it carries something real, the sense that the lighthouse keeper had come to represent not just the maintenance of light, but the maintenance of order in a world spinning unpredictably forward. With the chronometer in place, the board began rotating keepers more frequently. Tours shortened. Watch lengths became uniform. By the 1830s, Aylen Glass keepers worked 3-month shifts before relief. Everything was measured, compared, and verified. Precision had won, but something was lost too: the tick of the body, the count of steps, the soft chalk marks on bunkboards and window ledges. These weren't just crude stopgaps. They were the way people made sense of responsibility in a world before machines told them when to care. A single footnote in a board ledger from 1821 mentions a discarded timekeeping device found among Kerr's belongings. It was a leather pouch, inside which was a stone wrapped in cloth and marked with a single tally line. No explanation given. No value assigned. It now sits, without label, in the archives of the National Museum of Scotland. It is just a rock. And yet, perhaps, it is also a final protest against time as dictated. The lighthouse still stands. Aylen Glass continues to mark the hours with modern light, modern maintenance, and digital synchronization. But when the sea fog thickens and no vessels pass for days, one can still imagine a keeper alone in the tower, counting the seconds not with a clock, but with the soft passage of breath, the whisper of oil in the lamp basin, and the slow, steady rhythm of survival. Story 5. Salt Rust and Salt Pork. The Lifespan of a Keeper's Tools. Section 1. The Workbox on the Western Rocks. Sea corrodes everything. That was the first rule every lighthouse keeper came to understand long before they understood. The finer points of lamp maintenance, tide tables, or fog signal sequences. Salt is not just a presence in the air. It is an agent of unmaking. Brass foghorns dulled, steel gears pitted, door hinges seized up with white crusts of oxidized memory. Leather grew stiff, canvas rotted silently, wood split along its grain. Like old bread, the sea, in time, consumed all, but the lighthouse keeper fought back with oil, rags, grease, brushes, and endless patience. His tools were his only line of defense against a world that wished, hour by hour, to dissolve his tower back into the surf. On the western rocks, off the coast of Cornwall, stood Wolf Rock Lighthouse. Completed in 1870, after more than a decade of intermittent work, it was one of the most remote and most punishing stations in the British Isles. The men who served there often spoke of the place not as a building, but as a kind of trial. "She eats our boots," wrote one assistant keeper in 1882, "and then our hands, and then our minds, if we let her." Each keeper was assigned a workbox dot. It was a rectangular oak chest about 3 feet wide, fitted with brass clasps and leather straps. Inside were the essential tools of daily survival: a brass wick trimmer, a cast-iron oil can with a swan neck spout, a whetstone for knives, 2 chisels, a hammer, a roll of flax cord, a bone-handled folding knife, and a gray cotton cloth embroidered with the initials NLB Northern Lighthouse Board. The cloth was for wiping the lens. Nothing else. "Use it for boots, and you'll walk out barefoot," the instruction manual warned. There was also a small tin marked consumables. This tin contained sealing wax, graphite powder, spare flints, and matches. In later years, paraffin wax discs were added, used for lubricating the clockwork rotation of the lens platform. But the tin itself never changed, always unadorned, always dented from previous tours, that most keepers inherited their toolboxes from previous occupants. A few were brand new, issued to apprentices or replacements after a death. But even then, this new tools quickly took on the scent of age, the mixture of oil, salt, and coal smoke that marked every lighthouse interior dot. The tools told their own stories. One such box, now preserved at the Trinity House Depot in Harwich, belonged to keeper Edward Renshaw, who served at Wolf Rock from 1874 to 1886. His hammer head is polished smooth on one side, the result of years spent tapping corrosion from lamp brackets. The handle is wrapped in twine, where sweat had raised splinters. His wick trimmer is still sharp, though the tip is blunted, not from misuse, but from habit. Renshaw would tap the lens glass with it gently, a way of listening to the clarity. As he wrote in a letter home, "What's most striking is the greased tin. It is sealed with a screw lid that has been opened so many times the threads have worn thin. On its underside, scratched with what looks like a compass point, are 5 names: Renshaw, D. Llewellyn, S. Croft, Henry Meikle. It's likely these were all men who used the same tin over the years. A roll call etched in the only metal that stayed with them. Every object had to justify its presence. No room for luxuries. Yet even within these narrow parameters, creativity flourished. Some keepers fashioned extra handles for their brushes from broken chair legs. Others filed down iron bolts to make scrapers for lamp vents. More than one assistant was reprimanded for carving initials into lens housings, a practice that left ghostly grooves still visible under museum light today. In the maintenance logs, those tidy, hourly records required by the board sometimes bore notes in the margins that betrayed a more emotional relationship with tools. Wick trimming blade cracked again. 3rd time. Feels unfair. Grease nearly gone. Will barter coffee for more if relief comes. Lost chisel in sea. Heart sank with it. There was no workshop at most stations. Repairs had to be done with what was on hand. Nails were reused, ropes spliced and re-spliced. Lantern glass was sometimes repaired with boiled starch and cotton threads until new panes arrived by boat. But the strangest tool, and perhaps the most emblematic, was the salt pork hook. This was a curved iron rod, about the length of a forearm, used to retrieve salted meat from the brine barrels delivered every quarter. Most lighthouses received provisions in bulk flour, dried peas, tea, and pork packed in heavy barrels. The hook was used to fish out the meat without contaminating the brine. But in lean times, it served other roles: lifting stones, retrieving. Oil cans dropped into wells, even stirring paint. Keepers gave their pork hooks names. One from Sumburg Head was called Old Snatcher. Another from Bishop Rock was labeled James the Just. At Wolf Rock, the hook in Renshaw's chest bore a tag, Gladys. No explanation survives. When tools failed, the sea won out, and when the sea won, lives were at stake. In 1881, during a fierce storm, the lamp at Wolf Rock dimmed and stopped rotating. Investigation revealed that the lens table's rotation gears had seized due to inadequate lubrication. The keepers had run out of paraffin wax 2 weeks earlier and had attempted to improvise with mutton fat. It congealed in the cold. The lens froze. The light failed. 2 ships ran aground on the Scillies that night. The board inquiry was swift and unforgiving. Yet even as it blamed the keepers, it issued new protocols. Each workbox was to be inspected quarterly. Emergency wax rations would be doubled, and each keeper would henceforth be trained in gear maintenance using demonstration models at Trinity House. It was a strange kind of justice, the sort that punished first, then learned second, yet among keepers themselves, a kind of quiet reverence for tools endured. They spoke not of what a tool did, but of how it behaved. The chisel that moaned in brass, the lamp brush that never left streaks, the rag that felt right in the hand. These weren't just objects. They were extensions of the self, a kind of bridge between body and duty, between man and machine. And in time, they became talismans. Many keepers asked to be buried with a tool. One requested his knife, another his lamp key. A few were cremated. Their ashes mingled with a handful of oil soot or brass filings from their station. One keeper's widow, interviewed in 1932, said, "He loved that box more than me." And rightly so. It never answered back. That box now sits behind glass. Tools inside are worn, silent, motionless. But if you press your face close, you can still smell the oil, still see the grooves in the chisel handles, still imagine the salt-pocked air and the slow work of defiance in a world that never ceased to rust. Section 2. The grease log and the whisper of metal. If you opened a lighthouse logbook and ran your fingers down its entries past the wind speeds, lampwick records, and fog reports, you might eventually find a curious little category: grease applied to mechanism. Usually this was followed by a date, the keeper's initials, and sometimes a word or two light, dry, or sparingly. Occasionally, a more expressive keeper might write, "Grumbling gears quieted," or "Worked like a charm today." To those unfamiliar with the routines of lighthouse life, such notes might seem insignificant, almost absurd in their monotony. But to the keepers who lived inside these towers, a whisper from metal was a language they could not afford to misunderstand. The rotation of the lantern was perhaps the most delicate mechanism in the entire structure. From the 1850s onward, most major sea lights used a clockwork rotation system powered by falling weights, much like a grandfather clock. As the weight descended slowly down a central shaft over a period of hours, it drove a series of gears and pulleys that rotated the lens around the lamp. This produced the signature flash pattern that marked each lighthouse: one flash every 10 seconds or 2 flashes every minute, depending on the station's assigned code. If the rotation faltered, if the lens stuttered or stuck, ships could mistake the light for another station or fail to see it altogether. That failure could cost dozens of lives. Hence, the grease. The mechanism had to be oiled precisely and regularly. Too much, and it collected grit. Too little, and it wore itself to powder. The grease used was specially formulated, a thick blend of tallow, beeswax, and mineral oil, shipped in small sealed tins from the mainland. In winter, it had to be warmed, slightly placed near the stove, but never overheated, lest it become too runny. Applied cold, it clotted and gummed. A good keeper knew, and it was just right neither by thermometer nor instruction, but by feel. And smell. At Devon Lighthouse in western Scotland. A log from February 894 reads, 3 a.m. Noticed irregularity in gear click. Applied thin layer of grease to upper bearing. Smoothed. Wind still easterly. Sea thundering. Keeper Robertson advises tightening the belt next relief. Such entries were common, laconic, factual, but rooted in a deep attentiveness. Each mechanism, after years in salt air, developed its own peculiar rhythm, its own mood. Some ticked cheerfully, others whined. One keeper on the Smalls described his lamp gears as a cat with a thorn in its paw. He claimed he could hear it limping if the oil ran low. At times, the machinery did more than falter. It rebelled. It rebelled. In January of 1888, on the Farne Islands, the rotation system at Eddystone Lighthouse failed entirely. Ice had formed inside the gear housing. The assistant keeper, a former blacksmith, dismantled the entire assembly by lamplight, cleaned it with hot vinegar, and reassembled it with a mixture of boiled linseed and whale oil scraped from an old lantern. The mechanism turned again by midnight. The keeper's log noted simply, rotation resumed. Improvised mixture unpleasant to touch. Trinity House later sent a letter of commendation, along with a fresh tin of grease and a replacement rag. These rags, incidentally, were often held in even higher regard than the grease itself. Made of tightly woven gray flannel or cotton, they were used to apply oil, wipe down brass, and clean lenses. Each rag lasted weeks or months, until it disintegrated from use. Worn rags were often burned, but some were kept folded neatly into. The workbox, yellowed and stiff, as if containing memory. Assistant keeper Harold Meacham, who served at Aylen Glass in the early 1900s, once wrote to his brother, "I've used the same rag for 96 days now. It knows this lens better than I do. I wipe clockwise in the morning, anti-clockwise at night. Can't say why. It just feels right. The glass hums when it's clean. The grease hums when it's good." That notion that machines could hum with satisfaction was widespread among keepers. They were not mechanics in the modern sense, trained in shops or factories. They were self-taught stewards of precision, making do with partial knowledge and inherited wisdom. Their understanding of the machinery was intuitive, tactile, and often superstitious. A common belief, for instance, held that the best time to oil the gear wheels was just before dawn, when the sea's humidity reached its peak. Another was that if you heard 3 clicks instead of 2 in the gear case, a storm was on its way. Some claimed the lantern itself shuddered before a gale, not from wind, but from pressure inside the mechanism. It wasn't science. But it was rarely wrong. At Ardnamurchan, Scotland's most westerly lighthouse, the lamp table once seized entirely during a week of unrelenting sleet. The keeper on duty, alone and suffering from a toothache, dismantled the escapement gear and cleaned each cog with whiskey and a sliver of boiled potato. He left a note in the log. No grease left, used mash, successful, drank remainder. The event became something of a legend. The board never formally approved the method, but a year later, replacement keepers found a small note etched under the lamp housing. Potatoes in a pinch. Not all improvisations succeeded. One grim example comes from Rathlin Island, off the coast of Northern Ireland, where in 1873, the main gear drum cracked under pressure after a replacement assistant mistakenly used animal fat instead of clock. Grease. The fat hardened in the cold. The drum, made of brass, but already weakened by years of corrosion, shattered. It took 3 weeks for a replacement to arrive. The lamp had to be hand-rotated, day and night, by the 2 men taking turns every 15 minutes, like monks tending a flame. They slept in bursts, ate in silence, and logged their turns with a stub of pencil on the wall. Rotation me. Rotation Bill. Rotation May. Again. When finally relieved, both men were gaunt, sleepless, and suffering from frostbite in their fingers. But the lamp had never gone dark. Even today, many of the old lighthouses retain traces of this daily mechanical devotion. Visit the gear rooms. At St. Abb's Head or Cape Wrath, and you'll find brass housings smoothed from decades of hands, oil stains like shadows on the walls, and tiny notches carved into the wooden workbenches, one for each successful repair, perhaps. Or maybe just for counting time. A few stations had preserved their grease logs, faded and brown, bound in brittle leather. Some read like poetry. Applied tallow, sea roaring like kettles. Gears whined at 240. Quiet now. Rotation, flawless, wind from the north. God preserve us. Such entries remind us that lighthouses were never just buildings. They were instruments, delicate ones, and the men who tended them were not just watchmen, but technicians, musicians, caretakers of machines that had to breathe and turn and shine in harmony with the sea dot and grease. Simple, lowly, pungent. Grease was the lifeblood of it all. Section 3. Things repaired, things remembered. They were men who fixed things. That truth, more than anything, defined the lighthouse keepers of the 18th and 19th centuries. Before they were trained in lightkeeping, they had often been carpenters, fishermen, millwrights, tinsmiths, or sailmakers. They arrived at remote towers with practical skills and a quiet confidence in their hands. They did not expect comfort or help. They did not ask for replacements unless it was truly necessary. And so, everything that could be mended was a handle cracked, a splint of driftwood and a bit of twine. A stove hinge failed. Forge a new one from a disused barrel hoop. Compass. Case swollen from damp. Shave it down, oil it, let it rest. The workshop was almost always small. A side room or lean-to attached to the keeper's quarters, usually no more than 6 feet by 10. It had a wooden bench, a few pegs in the wall, and maybe, if the keeper had served long enough, a vise. Tools were few, but lovingly tended. A hammer, 2 or 3 files, a set of chisels, a small hand drill. The whetstone was often shared between. Sharpening knives and honing grass parts. Some keepers developed idiosyncratic habits. One in Yorkshire wrapped each tool handle in layers of cloth dipped in whale oil to keep them supple through winter. Another, in the Hebrides, notched his screwdriver with tally marks for every year he'd used it 18 by the end. But some repairs defied even their ingenuity. When the Fresnel lens itself cracked from heat, cold, or accident, it was a solemn event. The lens was the heart of the station, and its replacement required a costly and hazardous delivery from the mainland, often by rowboat or small steamer. Some keepers attempted to patch minor chips with beeswax, lampblack, or transparent glue. The results were rarely effective. Still, even these failed fixes were entered faithfully into the log, often with a note of apology. Attempted fill with pine resin still distorts at 2 o'clock. Chip remains. Shall polish around to compensate. Then there were the things that could not be repaired, but were kept anyway. The drawer of retired tools was a common fixture in lighthouse workshops. Broken files, cracked knobs, bent screwdrivers, each with a past. Perhaps they were kept out of thrift, perhaps out of memory. Keeper James Haldane, at Ardross and Light, once kept a spoon for 11 years after it broke at the stem. It had belonged to his first assistant, who drowned in a squall attempting to row ashore for medical supplies. Haldane used the spoon to mix lamp oil with alcohol when cleaning the wick tubes. In his final log before retirement, he wrote, "The spoon still stirs. The light still shines. I think he'd be glad." Objects accrued stories like barnacles. A dented tin used for grease might have survived a fire. A hacksaw, rusty at the edge, may have once been used to trim the coffin wood of a drowned sailor, brought ashore in a gale, and buried on the bluff behind the tower. Nothing was merely a thing. Everything had history embedded in its weight. Even consumables had meaning. Rope, coarse and reeking of pitch, was used until it frayed, then saved, in coils for kindling or caulking leaks in the boathouse. Spare brass screws, too rare to waste, were sorted into matchboxes. Candle stubs were melted and poured into old ink bottles to make stubby new lights. Old uniforms became patching cloth for window seals, and yet, despite their thrift, some keepers quietly believed that things were never truly mended. They were simply persuaded to carry on a little longer. That belief showed up in their language. They didn't say repaired. They said put right, or saw to it, or made do. Not out of humility, but because nothing stayed fixed for long, not in salt air, not in a place where iron rusted overnight and paint peeled like birch bark. Their repairs were not final acts. They were gestures of resilience. They were reminders that entropy could be held off, not defeated, but delayed by patience and effort. At some stations, old repaired items were passed down from one keeper to the next, like heirlooms. At Cape Pembroke, a 60-year-old oil can was said to have belonged to the original builder of the tower. At Mull of Galloway, a work apron stitched from sailcloth was worn by 3 generations of assistants. A note inside the workshop door read, "If the strap breaks, sew it again. It served your better men." There were also tools deliberately left behind when a keeper retired, not because they were forgotten, but because they were part of the station. Now, like a worn floorboard or a hand-carved door latch. One of the most poignant examples comes from the Skelligs lighthouse off the coast of Ireland. When keeper Padraig O'Callaghan left his post in 1901, after 27 years of service, he left behind a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas. Inside was a small brass bell, a driftwood-handled knife, and a folded piece of cloth with these words inked on it. "I used these when the storm broke the west window in '83, patched the frame, and stopped the rain. The lamp stayed dry. If another storm comes, and it will, these may help again." The package was kept in the storeroom until the light was automated in 1987. It was then sent to a maritime museum in Cork, where it remains on display. The cloth has darkened. The knife is pitted with age. But the words still show clearly, especially under lamplight. Keepers rarely saw themselves as craftsmen in the modern sense. They didn't celebrate their repairs. They didn't frame them. They simply did what was needed. But there is a kind of humble artistry in their perseverance. They didn't fix things to make them beautiful. They fixed them because the light must not go out. And so, every tool worn smooth by use, every cog refiled and realigned, every joint soldered and wrapped with cloth, these were not just signs of labor. They were declarations of care, quiet ones perhaps, but enduring. Even now, long after the last wick was trimmed and the last lens cleaned, their work remains. The lights they tended, some automated, some extinguished, still stand. And in their workshops, behind dusty doors and rusted hinges, you might still find an old oil can, or a wrench, or a greased tin with a faint smell of tallow, waiting to be used again.